Good afternoon, all the nerds out there. I hope you all are doing fine. And guess what? Today we are going to discuss about new historicism and a visual journey through Stephen Greenblatt's toward a poetics of culture. As you can see over the screen, we have like 5 slides that we are gonna cover everything about new historicism. So give me your 15 minutes, and I tell you that will be enough for that particular topic. So let's move on with the first slide. We need to understand first what is new criticism. Before that, we need to dive into something called cultural poetics. So this is basically a way of looking at literature that's all about digging into the historical context of a work and figuring out what it can tell us about the future and ideas of time. Now, this cultural poetics things, has been around for a while. It got pretty popular back in the 1950s, but it didn't really explode until the 1990s. And that's all thanks to our guy named Stephen Greenblatt. Greenblatt was trying to put together a bunch of essays, and he needed a snazzy title for the introduction. And guess what? In a bit of a creative frenzy, he came up with New Historicism. And he dropped this in 1982. Remember the date when he was talking about how Queen Elizabeth I got pretty ticked off about a revival of Shakespeare's Richard II, right before some big rebellion. Now, this whole new historicism thing made waves back then, and people say it's influenced pretty much every nook and cranny of English literary history. But here's the funny twist, guys. Some folk argue that it's not all that new or even all that historical. And then there is another guy came, Harold Aram Vesa, who put together a collection of essays in 1989, and he pointed out some key ideas that keep popping up in new historicism. First, there is the idea that every time somebody does or says something, it's tied to a bunch of real life stuff they're doing. Like, it's not just words, it's actions. Then there is this notion that when you're criticizing something or trying to expose what's wrong with it, you are using the very tools and ideas you are criticizing. It's like trying to take down your opponent in a game, but you're really playing by their rules. Next, this whole thing about text, and they're not just books. Everything we say, read, or write is all mixed up together. You can't separate the literary stuff from the real world stuff. And there are no eternal truth or unchanging human nature. Everything fluid, always changing. So if you are trying to understand culture, you have got to roll with the punches. Last but not least, when you're studying culture, you're actually part of it. Your method and the way you talk about it are part of the whole process. And it's like being in a game and commenting on it at the same time. All right, now let's break down this fancy stuff in plain English. New historicism, okay? It sounds like a big deal, right? But well, it is actually a big deal. And it's all about looking at history and politics when we study literature. It owes a bit to Marxism, which sees literature as part of a bigger picture where the economy plays a starring role. But new historicists, they are a bit more flexible. They don't just focus on money stuff, they see power all over the place in society. They got this idea from a guy named Michel Foucault. Here's the twist. New historicism treats society like a giant book club. They say everything in our world is like a bunch of texts talking to each other, and there is no one right way to read them. This is like postmodernism but for history. You might hear folk call it cultural materialism too. So these folks are even more about using their studies to change things right now. New historicism pals around with an old idea too. This guy named Hippolyte, and I bet you know about him, thought that books aren't just made up in author's head, they are shaped by the society they come from. He had this fancy idea of race, milieu, and moment. It's like saying where you're from, the people around you, and the time you live in all leave their mark on what you write. Now, new historicism isn't the same as those old ideas. It's got a big crush on ideology. And that's like the hidden ideas and belief that sneak into what folks write, even if the writer didn't realize it. So, in a nutshell, it's all about digging deep into literature with the history detective's eyes, right? Stephen Greenblatt. He's all about Shakespeare and history with a touch of being a literary giant. And since the year 2000, he's been the John Cogan University Professor of the Humanities at Harvard University. That's like being the head boss of humanities there. Plus, he's got a thing for Shakespeare and he's the big boss behind the Norton Shakespeare from 2015. That's like the ultimate guide to all things about Shakespeare. Now, remember how I mentioned he's into history, right? Well, he's not just any historian, guys. He's one of the brains behind new historicism. He calls it cultural poetics, and that's quite important term, and you might face it in exam. And they have been asking about this particular term in your exam as well. And this cultural poetics, which basically means he's all about looking at history and culture in a whole new light. And he's not just a thinker, he's a doer too. He helped start a journal called Representation, where they publish stuff from other new historicists. But wait, there is more. His claim to fame is a biography of Shakespeare called Will in the World. People loved it so much he got a Pulitzer Prize for it in 2012. Greenblatt was written about all sorts of things, like his adventure in Laos and China, stories, and even miracles. And if you've heard a book of called Tyrant Shakespeare on Politics, that's his too. He wrote it because he was feeling a bit uneasy after the 2016 US presidential election. Back when he was teaching at the University of California, Berkeley, he got involved in something interesting, founding a journal called Representation. And this journal became a stage for some early and important new historicist ideas. Now let's talk about towards a poetics of culture. So as we are already into the world of new historicism, with a casual chat about Stephen Greenblatt, back when he was teaching at the University of California, Berkeley, he got involved into something interesting, guys. And he found, as we know, a journal called Representations. The journal became a stage for some early and important new historicism ideas. Now, what really got the new historicism ball rolling was Greenblatt's into the power of forms in the English Renaissance. In 1982, in this introduction, he made a clear distinction between new historicism and a couple of other ways people looked at literature. First off, there is the new criticism crew. These folks see a text like a self-contained pleasure just waiting to be solved. And we have already discussed thoroughly about new criticism in our previous session. You can go back and check it out and come back then. But anyway, then there is the older historicism gang, which had this idea of finding one big political theme in everything. But here's where new historicism steps in and does its thing. Greenblatt argued that both of these older methods tried to blend all these different pieces into one neat picture. So this guy named Greenblatt, he had some interesting thoughts about it and he shared them in an influential essay in 1987. Now he didn't try to give us a textbook definition of new historicism. Instead, he wanted to show us what it's all about in practice. The big difference from old school historical scholarship from the early 1900s is that this new historicism is open to new ideas, especially the fancy theories that were popping up at the time. Greenblatt was all about Foucault, anthropology, and what social theory. He thought it would be cool to see how new historicism connected with Marxism and post-structuralism. He mentioned some stuff from the Marxist Frederick Jameson and the post-structuralist Jean Francois Lyotard. They were both trying to figure out how art and society are connected. So here's the big deal. New historicism is all about being aware of the methods you see. It's not like the old days when people thought their interpretation were the only truth. New historicism says a work of art is the result of whole bunch of stuff. It's like a negotiation between the people who made it with all their traditions and ideas and what society was like at that times. Now let's talk about Greenblatt's own books. He got a couple of famous ones like a Renaissance self-fashioning from 1980s and Shakespeare negotiations from 1988. In Renaissance self-fashioning, he digs into how people shaped their identities back in the 16th century. Imagine all these different groups and ideas clashing and competing like politics, religion, family, and colonial stuff. It was a wild time, and Greenblatt showed how it influenced how people saw themselves. And you know what's cool about New Historicism? It's not stuck in one camp. It borrows ideas from Marxism, feminism, structuralism, and post structuralism. It's like a big melting pot of theories, and it's been a game changer in how we study literature in its cultural context. Now let's move to the other new historicist, starting with Louis Montrose. First up, we got Louis Montrose, who's not only an American scholar but also a pretty talented photographer too. Talk about a Renaissance person, he's delved into all sorts of cool stuff like literature, history, and deep theoretical ideas. His work has been a game changer in the world of Renaissance studies and theatre. Montrose, as we know, is a big deal in the realm of New Historicism, and his main focus is on the dynamics of the Elizabethan era. After a long and impactful academic journey, he decided to hang up his academic hat in 2010. Now let's shift our spotlight to Jonathan Goldberg. Goldberg has made some major waves in the field, much like a literary rock star. His contributions have had a big impact, especially in the realm of New Historicism. He's all about exploring those juicy historical and theoretical themes, and he's a pro at connecting literature to the broader context of the time. His work is like a time machine that takes you back to the Elizabethan era. You only have to remember these two names. You don't need to know what important thing they did at all, because in New Historicism our main focus is Stephen Greenblatt and also the culture poetics, and these two things you really need to remember in New Historicism. The rest you only need to know about their names, that's all. And the last we got H. Aram Visa. This guy is no small fry either. He's been in the thick of things, contributing his insight to the world of literature and history. Like the others, he's been a part of New Historicism movement, which is all about, as we know, digging deep into history and literature to uncover hidden gems. These three scholars have made their mark, and they're all part of this fascinating world where history and literature collide. So there you have it, guys. This was all about these other New Historicism, and at the end we have the conclusion here. Neo-Historicism is an intricate field of cultural theory based on relationship between text and context, as we know. In our second or third slide, we talked about Greenblatt's concept regarding New Historicism and his Poetics of Culture, which is quite important that you should remember. And of course, we also have delved into the definition of the field and its origin and its powerful influence on the way we think and comprehend contemporary culture. So guys, this all journey has reached its conclusion, and that's all, right? And we'll see you in our next session where we'll talk about reader response theory or criticism. So be there. That's all for today, guys. And if you haven't subscribed the channel, you should do it right away, so you will not miss any important session on literary criticism, theory, and of course British literature. By the way, thank you so much and have a good day. Bye bye.